Good evening, and welcome to MTSO virtually through our Theological Commons Public Theology Initiative. MTSO is a graduate school providing theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. So we are so grateful tonight to have Isaac Villegas with us to lead us in this conversation. Isaac is the pastor of Chapel Hill Mennonite Fellowship and serves as the president of the governing board of the North Carolina Council of Churches. He is a contributing editor for the Christian Century magazine and a member of the editorial committee for the Anabaptist Witness Journal. He is also a columnist for the Christian Century, Sojourners, and the Anabaptist World magazines. And he's many other things, including friend to many. Isaac, we are grateful to have you with us to lead us in this conversation. I will invite all who are participating tonight to enter questions or comments in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It's different from the chat box. And when he's finished with his talk, we will have a time of response to as many of those questions as we can get to in the webinar format. So with that, I will turn it to you, Isaac.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for that introduction. Very grateful to be here with you and all my friends. Yeah, very excited for this evening with you all. I'm grateful for the invitation. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about my experience of immigrant solidarity work in my very long life of 40 years. But yeah, I'm going to give a little history about myself as background, and then talk about what it's been like to be a pastor of a congregation and do immigrant solidarity work in that context. And then maybe offer some thoughts to think about how you all can be involved in this work from where you all are located. So first, I wanted to start with myself. I hope that's okay. Talking about myself here, but yeah, I wanted to show you kind of like the geography where I grew up. I'm a child of Latin American immigrants. My mom from Central America, from Costa Rica, and my dad from Colombia. They migrated over here to kind of south of LA area. Spent my growing up years there, and also had family down here just north of San Diego. Oops. And as you can see, there's the border with Mexico, and there's a road that runs, you can see it up here most clearly, Interstate 5, runs down through here, oops, all the way down through San Diego, and then goes all the way down Mexico into Central America to South America. It's called the Pan American Highway. Growing up, there was, when I was a kid, this is the 80s, growing up in LA and then traveling down to San Diego, there's a checkpoint. I grew up with it, going through this checkpoint, right? I mean, I think it's right around there. It's an immigration checkpoint. And whenever I'd go visit my family down in San Diego and Vista and have to go back, we'd have to drive through that checkpoint. A lot of times there's nobody there. Sometimes there were people there. La Migra, immigration police. And they would look in your car, they'd racially profile, figure out if you looked suspicious. This was during the drug war, so-called drug war. US was funding all sorts of the militarization in Central and South America to combat the distribution, manufacture of drugs. Anyhow, for all those reasons, they would stop us, and if they were, for whatever reason, we looked suspicious, whatever that might mean, we'd be detained and have to wait for them to clear us by. Most of the time, there was nobody there, and we would just be nervous driving through. later on, we moved. My dad was a factory worker, and they moved the factory from LA all the way over here to Tucson. This was in the midst of NAFTA, so having to do with finding less expensive labor, taxes closer to the border. Anyhow, so we moved with the factory, so moved over here to Tucson. And we would spend a lot of our time driving back to visit family in San Diego and up to LA. And we would drive on this highway right here, Interstate 8. Interstate 8, and then you can see it right after Yuma, it goes right there, dips almost by the border. You could see the border if there was such a thing as a border wall at that point, but there was nothing, it was just desert. So drive through there. And here, just on the other side of Yuma, there was also a checkpoint where, again, they would stop you if you looked suspicious. And apparently a family of 4 in a minivan, what was that minivan? It wasn't an Aerostar minivan driving Interstate 8 was suspicious. So there were times when we were stopped. I remember I've checked in with my dad about this, and I'm pretty sure I was maybe 6 years old was my first memory of being stopped and him being detained. You know, he's taken away. The drug dog came and sniffed, like they took us all out of the van, all of our luggage, the dogs went around sniffing everything, took away my dad. You know, I was 6 years old at the time. I had no idea what was going on. All I just knew that my dad was gone for what felt like hours, and I didn't know if I'd see him again. But yeah, he came back and we continued on our journey. So every time we would make that trip, which was frequent because we'd visit our family a lot in San Diego or in Vista, we were always nervous having to drive through that area, that checkpoint there, and then also over there. So yeah, just to give you maybe a little background of my experience of growing up with worrying about border police, not even understanding why exactly that was something I needed to worry about, but that constant fear whenever we would travel of, you know, is this the time they stop us and take away my dad for longer, you know, I don't know. So yeah, so I was, Chinga la migra has been in my blood since forever. So yes, that's where I grew up. Later on, I moved to North Carolina, where I live now, for school. Stuck around, became a pastor, and those early years when I was a pastor during the Obama era, and those early years of hope that we all had with Obama, who was great in a lot of ways, were quickly dashed as he built up the immigration enforcement system that Trump capitalized on during his administration. But all that infrastructure was laid during Obama, and we kind of got a clue early on among our activist circles, community organizing folks, of what was going on when there was a piece, I want to say it was in The Nation or The Atlantic, I can't remember right now, called Ice Castles. And it was this expose, I think within the first couple of years of Obama's first term, where there were these regional ICE detention centers that were being set up in office parks throughout the United States, unmarked. They were just, you know, there. That were detention centers. That were these small detention centers where people would be, if they're arrested by ICE, they were taken to the detention center as kind of a transition point as they moved further south to the main detention centers. So we read about this and we were like, wow, maybe they're around here. We need to figure this out. So this is in North Carolina and Durham. And because of our friendships, relationships, solidarity work in various communities, we were able to follow where these vans were going when they would kidnap people, when ICE would kidnap people from neighborhoods. And we tracked these vans, to a nondescript business park in the middle of like suburbia between Raleigh and Durham. All there are just office parks after office parks. Like there's that big publisher. I think it's Oxford University Press has this huge, they were the next door neighbor to this little unmarked brick building. You wouldn't notice anything about it if you just looked at it. But if you drove down into the parking lot and you looked around back, there were ICE vans, these white unmarked vans. There wasn't even a flag. They didn't even have a flag marking this place. Anyhow, so we figured out what it was, that this was one of these regional ICE centers. And we decided to do a public action there. So this was organizing with various activist communities, religious communities, non-religious communities. There's a pilgrimage during Holy Week. Mostly Catholic folks are involved, but all sorts of people tag along. I'm a Catholic tag along. And we decided to, during Holy Week, to have a public demonstration there on Maundy Thursday, on Holy Thursday. So Holy Thursday is a time of foot washing traditionally, where we wash one another's feet as a gesture of God's love, Jesus's love for us. And so we decided to do that there at that immigration center and demand that we wash the feet of our kinfolk who were being held inside. So we all organized ourselves. We showed up all at the same time. There's probably, I don't know, 20, 30 of us. Delivered a letter, tried to walk into the front door, but they immediately locked it when they saw us coming. And so we delivered a letter under the door, the glass door, and requesting that we be able to wash the feet of people being detained in the center. They didn't respond. We walked around back to the intake area and basically set up shop. We had a worship service right there, a foot washing service. We set up 2 chairs and, basin and towels, wrote up a liturgy for us to use. And we had 1 chair for people who I could wash their feet. And the other chair was absent, was empty, as a symbol for the people kept inside, the people detained, the people deported, all members of our community who have been taken from us, stripped away, members of the body, kind of, how we understand the church, a body of Christ, every member. We were bound together with other members. So to think about these people and this deported and held in the detention center, kept from us with that empty chair as a sign that they were our missing limbs. If one member of the body suffers, all suffer. So the chair became a way to symbolize the woundedness of our bodies, of our church bodies. That first year we did it, the ICE coordinated with the local police, and they came and disrupted our service. I had an ICE officer just shouting, came right up in the middle of my homily. He came up and told me to get off the property, and we decided that we would not let anyone interrupt our worship service. And so I preached through him shouting, and we continued with our service. They backed down and let us have that service. We continued to go there every year during Obama's administration to publicize the fact that they were trying to keep this hidden from the public, to bring attention, bring awareness that this was a problem, that we as community members thought that our society should not be like this. We should not have these detention centers. We should not have ICE agents invading neighborhoods and communities. So we continued on doing that through the Obama administration, and not much happened. It was Obama kept on deporting folks. At the time we called him the deporter in chief. Obama was known in Latin American communities, immigrant communities, as the deporter in chief because of what he set up and how many people he deported. We, like a lot of people, didn't know what was coming with Trump. We had no idea that I mean, we had some idea, obviously he said what he was about from the beginning. But in terms of like how bad it could be, as soon as we heard the news, as we experienced the news that he was elected in that November 4 years ago, we began to organize. We got worried. We got worried about what this was going to mean in terms of immigration. I imagine everybody remembers that he ran on a white supremacist platform of trying to build a wall and get rid of as many immigrants, brown people as possible. So we knew it was going to be bad. We had no idea how bad it was going to be, but we decided to start organizing ourselves. And a bunch of us in the area who have been organizing in the past doing solidarity work in immigrant communities in North Carolina, we had developed relationships. So we decided to start talking together about how to prepare, what kind of coalition work would be important for us. So church people, non-church people, religious, non-religious, activist communities, we all met together here and there. Folks like Witness for Peace was an organization established in the 80s to bring attention to the US sponsored wars in Nicaragua and in Central America. So folks with Witness for Peace, with American Friends Service Committee, which has always worked for immigrant justice, at least in our state and elsewhere. Church World Service, we had Church World Service folks on the ground in North Carolina that met with us. And we developed what we called the North Carolina Sanctuary Coalition and began to start talking to churches to prepare people for the possibility of for congregations to open up their doors and let people live in churches to escape the threat of deportation under Trump's regime. So this coalition work was built on long-term relationships, and we would have representatives go around to different churches to talk about what sanctuary would involve. I felt like a Methodist, you all have those circuit preachers? I can't remember. I went to a Methodist school seminary as well. But yeah, I was going around to like as many churches as I can, just spreading the good news of church sanctuary throughout our state, telling people how to do it. At least how we thought we could pull this off. We were just trying to find some way to organize ourselves to show that we were just not going to be complicit with Trump's regime, that we wouldn't collaborate, that we just try to do something, anything to struggle against kind of the racialized social engineering of our communities that he promised. So these partnerships grew into an understanding of what solidarity work would mean as churches together working to defend people who are threatened with deportation. I should also say that this work was not just ecclesial. I mean, not just probably isn't the right descriptor there, because this is very important. But this, we realized that, it wasn't just enough to support people who, like individuals who wanted to escape from the threat of deportation by living in churches one at a time, but that we needed some kind of comprehensive plan too for our state. And so we began doing partnerships with electoral work. So there was a number of counties that were 287G partners. So that meant that local law enforcement agencies, county police, sheriff's department, city police, that they would partner with ICE and they would go through this program with the federal government so that these law enforcement agents would be deputized as ICE agents. And so that would authorize them to arrest folks that they thought didn't have documentation and to push them into this ICE deportation pipeline. Anyhow, so that program is called 287G. And we began trying to highlight how that was something we didn't want in our communities. So we staging ways of protesting against that. Also talking to sheriffs, trying to figure out ways to let sheriffs know that we did not want them to comply with what are called ICE detainers. I'm sorry, this is probably getting too technical, but ICE detainers, just real quick, ICE detainers were, it could be part of a 287G county, but not necessarily so. It just is the agreement between a sheriff that if they arrest somebody and they run their identity and they don't have legal documentation, that the sheriff's department would hold them in their facility for enough time so that ICE agents can come and deport them. So those are called ICE detainers. Sheriffs and counties are interested in this sort of thing because they get kickbacks from the government, the federal government. So we would show that we did not want that and to protest against that. All that to say, church work can fit very nicely, and it seems appropriate to make sure that we are caring for people outside of our churches and in wider political spaces as well. There's nothing against the law for churches to protest against bad laws. So yeah, make sure you all keep that in mind. Okay, so church sanctuary, protective church sanctuary. So that became, as our coalitions developed, we started talking to churches being like, all right, we want to open our space to protect people who are under threat of deportation. This is building in the long tradition of sanctuary, of churches as being sanctuaries for people who need some kind of asylum from the law. So in the 1980s, here in the United States, this was very important, especially in the Southwest part of the country, where I grew up, as these US-sponsored wars in Central America created all of these refugees who were fleeing for their lives up into the United States, fleeing from violence, from totalitarian regimes, from CIA-sponsored death squads, all these folks. The US would not acknowledge any of these people as refugees from war, asylum seekers. And so they had to cross the border without permission, and churches were being set up to house them. So the Presbyterian Church in Tucson was kind of, Southside Presbyterian it's called, was kind of one of the first churches that opened its doors and made a public declaration. They said, you know what? They had a press conference. They said, we are providing protective sanctuary here in our church for people who don't have documentation, and federal agents, you better not trespass into the sanctuary of the Lord. We obey God's law here. And that became a movement. There were churches throughout the United States that were also protesting against the US-sponsored wars in Central America, and also wanted to receive people who were fleeing from that violence, seeking asylum. So churches throughout the United States opened their doors and declared public sanctuary for folks. They developed what was called an overground railroad, where people would be in like these clandestine meeting centers, like at Southside Presbyterian or somewhere in Texas. People would show up and they would drive people further north to places that were not as populated with immigration patrol, so that people can find some modicum of freedom for a while. So yeah, so there's an overground railroad of people who use their status, their citizenship status, to drive folks all the way up to Chicago was an important center, through North Carolina, up into Canada, trying to find freedom. So we kind of learned from that movement in the 1980s, the sanctuary movement, which I should say is also based on long church traditions, going all the way back to, you see glimpses of this even in the 2nd century. Clement of Rome describing churches being open for people who are fleeing the punishment of the law, and that the churches should be spaces to open up for this. Augustine in City of God talks about the importance of this when Rome was being ransacked, that churches were holy places where people can find asylum. There's various church councils that said that this was an important part of church teaching, that churches should be places of sanctuaries from the law. I could go into details all of that, but yeah, it gets a little cumbersome. But I should say one of the interesting things that I learned in studying this is one of the important passages that people would cite, whether they be bishops in those first centuries, in their council, these council agreements that they would make, a surprising passage that they would quote as justification for churches interceding on behalf of these people who were threatened with punishment from the law was 1 Timothy chapter 2. So, whoever thought anything good could come from those Deutero-Pauline letters, but yeah, they used. Let me just read the verse here. It's just so shocking to me. It says 1 Timothy 2, first verse. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone. I mean, that's the verse. That's what they quoted. And the word they latched onto there was intercession. That's what churches were doing when they would provide sanctuary for people fleeing from the law, is that they were interceding, standing in the way between the magistrate and the person who was deemed as worthy of punishment. That they were mediators. They were standing in the place. I think that's a fascinating reading, and why nothing wrong with proof texting. If you can find a Bible verse to justify your justice work, hey, nothing wrong with that. Always good work, proof texting. And 1 Timothy, who would have thought? Anyhow, so there's a long history of this in terms of church work. We set up our sanctuary network in this same model or in the same tradition, I should say, this church tradition of extending sanctuary, using our church spaces to intercede on someone's behalf and protect them from the punishment, the activity of law and police. In North Carolina, the first person who entered church sanctuary during Trump's regime, Trump's administration, was Juana Tobar. She, at the very beginning, basically as soon as, she actually might have entered in right before Trump was inaugurated, at St. Barnabas Episcopal Church in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is probably about, like an hour and a little bit from where I live. And she is still there. Juana is still in sanctuary. She still has not felt comfortable, even with the new administration. Biden promised that he was going to pause all deportations, and he's still deporting people. So Juana has not felt comfortable leaving it. So she's still in sanctuary. She's she's lived on the premises of St. Barnabas Episcopal Church for over 4 years now. It's just her perseverance, her strength is just remarkable to me. Later on, there's a documentary that we'll share a link to. It's called Sanctuario, which is just an amazing window into the hardship, the dedication that it takes for someone to be, the faith, the hope that's for someone to be in sanctuary. It follows Juana's story. So she was the first one. At the most, we had 6 people in North Carolina in public protective church sanctuary. So these are people who publicized the fact that they were entering the church sanctuary, that we were doing this publicly in protest against the law, and that they were going to live there and not step foot off of church property for as long as it takes for them to find some respite from the law, for laws to change or for the federal government to stop deporting people. This was enabled to happen, at least the window of opportunity in terms of our work in sanctuary, was enabled to happen because of an Obama era memo where he directed the Department of Homeland Security that agents were not allowed to trespass onto church property. There's other things too that they weren't allowed to do. They weren't allowed to trespass onto, or they wouldn't call it trespass. They weren't allowed to enter these spaces called sensitive locations, where in order to conduct their work. So ICE agents would not be allowed to go into hospitals. Like any kind of medical facility was named as a sensitive location. They could not go on there to arrest and deport people. Schools, public demonstrations. I was always a little complicated. We weren't never sure exactly what that meant. And churches, or places of worship, I should say, any religious community, were deemed as inappropriate for ICE agents to trespass. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Onto church property to arrest people. So that was kind of the window that invited us into this work. We would point to this memo. My friend, a colleague, comrade, peer, Joel Miller, pastor of Columbus Mennonite, where Edith has been in sanctuary. His line about this is great. He calls this memo, it's basically like a glorified email. So Obama sends this email to the Department of Homeland Security and says, hey, please don't do this. And that's basically the only, it could change just like that. It's not law. It's just a memo, a glorified email that we kind of just use as an opportunity to house folks, to protect them. So our church, Chapel Hill Mennonite, we share space with a Presbyterian church, Church of Reconciliation in Chapel Hill. And we began a conversation with them about offering sanctuary to somebody. And that was for us as Mennonites, that was like the quickest decision we've ever made. I mean, there's long jokes about Mennonites taking forever to do communal discernment to make decisions. That happened like one church life meeting. It was just like, all right, yes, we want to do this. We will do whatever we can to help our neighbors, protect folks from this administration. So we wrote a letter to the Presbyterian Church saying this is something we'd like to do. Took them a little bit longer. And we came up with a covenant, a partnership. And as soon as we did that, Rosa del Carmen got a hold of us through American Friends Service Committee work, saying that she would like to enter into sanctuary. So we actually had her meet with Juana Tobar, who was in sanctuary, just so that Rosa could get a sense for what it would require of her to make sure this is something she wanted to do. And after that meeting, Rosa came into sanctuary at our church, had a press conference. We let the regional office of ICE say, hey, look, we are housing this person. We believe this is what our faith calls us to do. You're not allowed to set foot onto church property. She's going to remain here until she has guarantees that she can return to her life, her family here in this country freely without threat of deportation. So Rosa was in sanctuary in our church for most of the Trump administration. She was able to fight her legal case. We provided room for her to, time for her to fight her legal case, and she won actually through various appeals up into the Fourth Circuit. The Fourth Circuit finally overruled. I could talk to you about details of her case. It's interesting, but usually interesting for people who know or care about immigration law and how it all works. The thing about church sanctuary that I discovered is, I mean, it just took everything we had, our congregation, in terms of volunteers, reaching out to the community for folks to volunteer with us. I mean, we just had to attend to all of her needs, coming up with grocery lists, people to buy groceries for her to bring them back. We had to remodel some of the church property so that she could have a shower, a bathroom. And I thought we were, like figuring it out. Overnight. We provided overnight accompaniment. So people would stay there 24 hours actually at the beginning, but just for her own safety, for people to be a part of that. For that work there required so much organization, so many volunteer hours. I think at one point we had something like 200 and something people who volunteered from churches throughout and non-church people to make this happen. But, it's one of those things where we never, I thought we were figuring everything out and prepared for her. But then I remember getting a text and she's like, so what do we do about laundry? And I was like, oh my gosh, laundry. Did not think about laundry, of course. So it was basically a learning experience for us. And she was very gracious, patient with us as we figured out what we needed to do to support her. This was an act of civil disobedience. This is actually hard. I mean, I got to be careful what I say these days, actually. It could be the case that a federal agent, if a federal attorney could prosecute this kind of stuff as harboring illegal aliens is the way the law is written. So when I would prepare churches for this work and considering the ramifications of it, I would, let people know that to consider this as civil disobedience, this work as church-sponsored civil disobedience. You could even be prosecuted for providing material support, is what it's called. So, like all those people, the folks who provide water in the desert in Arizona, some of them have been prosecuted for providing material support for a fugitive, for illegal alien is the language in the law. Anyhow, so I would make sure I would tell people like, hey, thanks for bringing food, helping to support Rosa with food and the other folks in sanctuary, but realize that like making that casserole dish is an act of subversive civil disobedience. This is like the one time in your life where you can make casseroles as an act of civil disobedience. Yeah, just thinking about the time here. I just mentioned one story about how poorly this can go in our solidarity work, how hard it is. One person who was in sanctuary in a part of our collective, one of the 6 people in sanctuary in North Carolina, he was kind of deceived, fed some lies, very sinister work, where he was asked to go to a meeting at an immigration center to leave sanctuary. He was in sanctuary at a church, asked to leave in order to get they said he had a chance of filing paperwork for humanitarian parole is what it was called. And we accompanied him there, and ICE agents, plainclothes ICE agents were there, and they just basically tore him from our arms and kidnapped him and put him on arrested all of us who were there supporting him and deported him to Mexico. And it was just a very sad, heartbreaking situation. So much more to tell about that story. There's the video there in the link if you want to learn more about what went down. Grateful for the documentarians who were able to do that important work. All right, so as I think about closing here, something to leave us with, all of this is just so fresh for me, I should say, the sanctuary work. Yesterday, it's as fresh as yesterday for me. So yesterday I accompanied Rosa to the USCIS, which is in the US federal agency in charge of immigration paperwork, all of that. I accompanied her to an appointment there. So she's no longer under threat of deportation. She's been granted temporary relief under an obscure law. God bless immigration attorneys. I mean, they do some amazing work. Anyhow, so I accompanied her yesterday so that she could apply for a work permit. And after I did that, I had this app on my phone, this texting app, which we set up so that anyone in our coalition, if anyone was being threatened of deportation, people can sign up for this text app, and you would just text an address. And I think at some point we might have had 500, 700 people who would receive this text to show up to defend with their bodies the deportation of somebody in sanctuary. So I deleted that yesterday after Rosa successfully showed up to this federal appointment and submitted her paperwork, and I saw with my very own eyes that she was not deported or arrested. So this is all very, like, I'm still trying to process what this is going to mean. I know in Columbus there with Columbus Mennonite, with Edith Espinal, who's been in sanctuary there in that church, same thing there. It's kind of just trying to figure out what this new world means. and to celebrate, but also to realize things are just kind of uncertain still. We're all very tentative. And that, like, perseverance matters, hope matters. Now is the time to continue to fight for immigrant justice work. One thing that I'm now and this is just, again, very fresh for me, is I am trying to figure out what to do with, I expected a movement. I was inspired by the 1980s. I expected that this sanctuary work would be an opportunity for churches to kind of show up in immigrant solidarity work and to really do something that matters for the lives of individuals. And it just didn't happen during Trump administration. I think at the most, there was maybe like mid 40s of churches, almost 50 churches throughout the United States who had people living in sanctuary in their churches, which is just not the thousands that they were during the 80s. So I'm just trying to sort through the fact that it didn't become a movement. And the other thing I'm sorting through is I admit that I have a very soft liberal heart. I lean towards a kind of humanism and expect the best out of people. And I thought that when Christians, white evangelical Christians who put Trump into office, I mean, there's other people too, but the vast majority white evangelicals voted for Trump. I thought that maybe this attempt at public demonstration to see churches being like, you know what, God's way is different. I thought that would matter. I thought telling people stories would, tug on the heartstrings of folks, that there was something to like a politics of empathy that happened in the 1980s. That like this church sanctuary movement would expose the way that the sinister ways that this government operates sometimes. And instead, this administration caged children. And Trump got his base and won more votes. So I'm just really struggling these days with trying to get the sense of the lay of the land, and realizing that apparently there's a cruelty in this country where a politics of empathy doesn't matter. That there's that white supremacy is so entrenched that there seems to be nothing to do to reach out to some folks. I didn't expect that. That has been something that I've come to, the liberalism in me has died. And I'm trying to sort through what the next steps might be as we struggle for immigrant justice work going forward. I would say maybe two things as I think about immigrant justice work going forward. One is that we need to consider, I think those of us who are citizens really need to consider what we consider worth our citizenship. Like what's worth it? What are our documents worth in terms of being citizens? Citizenship, the flip side of citizenship is deportations, is children in cages, is border wall, is deaths in the desert. Like the only reason why citizenship matters is the threat of deportation. In some sense, you can just think about the citizenship as, at least in the US, as basically segregation on a global scale. Citizenship plays right into immigration enforcement mechanisms, to trade agreements, all these things where we as US citizens get cheap products, but don't allow the people who manufacture stuff into this country. and so that they have to work for, work for very poor wages elsewhere, and we can get cheap goods here. So I think I'm beginning to realize that there's the work that needs to be done is to consider the shadow side of citizenship, that a citizen creates the alien, citizen creates the foreigner, the migrant. A good theorist on this is Giorgio Agamben, if anyone is interested in exploring how to think about this. But that our lives are coded, which has become a racialized code of this binary between citizen and alien. And that feels like an increased problem to me. Just going to share this screen real quick here, just for you all to get a sense for, oops, let me start that over. Just for you to see the border deaths. I can talk a long time about this, but I don't have a long time. So here is, how do I get rid of this thing? Okay, that's my timer. A couple more minutes. So this is the border. Here's Mexico, this is Arizona. Every dot is a migrant who's died crossing the border. This is created by US immigration policy, what you see here. It's called prevention through deterrence. So people have been forced through border enforcement, through walls, so that the only places that they can cross are places where the environment is weaponized and people end up dying. So this is a website where you can see all the people who died. I should say the remains that are found. So these are people whose remains have been found. And each dot you can click on and it'll give you the best they can do to figure out who the person was. So here's someone, the date that was reported that their remains were found, an unidentified male. And then you can just see, oh, that's all they know about that person. Go over here. Some of them have names. They're able to find names. Most of them are nameless. So since the prevention through deterrence policy, there's been over 7,000 deaths documented of people who died in the desert. And that's just documented. Some people, you just don't find their remains. The most that has been found in a given year was in 2010. The most remains found of migrants in the desert here in Arizona was in 2010 until last year. Last year broke the record. I want to say it was something like 230 remains were found. Is that worth it? I mean, basically is the question that I think to myself that I want to pose to all of you. Is it worth it to have citizenship, privileges of citizenship that are paid for with a blood sacrifice? I will stop there since I'm over time. And I'll leave you, actually, no. I'm like, this is a classic preacher move. I'm done, but really, no, one more thing. Last thing. There's this line that has come to me from Fred Moten, who's a Black theorist, really important theorist. He used to be in North Carolina now. I think he's in California. But he has this line which is haunting for me. And I think about this in terms of citizenship and all these deaths on the border. He says, how do we comport ourselves towards the enemy when the enemy is us? How do we comport ourselves to the enemy when the enemy is us? What does it mean? How do we operate in this world when the fact of our citizenship is established on a blood sacrifice on the border? I'll close with that.
I mean, you can go into preach mode, Isaac. If you haven't heard Isaac preach, you need to. Thank you for giving us so much to think about already. And I see some questions coming into the Q&A. So I've actually invited our associate dean and our associate professor of Christian ethics, Dr. Yvonne Zimmerman, to kind of lead that discussion and Q&A time. Please go ahead and continue to add questions there as you might have them, and watch the chat. We will continue to add some resources that Isaac has given us. So thanks again, Isaac.
The first thing that I want to say is actually not a question, but is to let folks know, and Isaac, I don't know if you might have seen this earlier today, but Miriam Vargas, who has been in sanctuary at First Lutheran Church in Columbus, met with her attorneys today and was able to go home. So that means that both of the women who've been in long-term sanctuary here in Columbus, both have been in sanctuary, I believe, for over 2 years, are now free. And I've got that link, I believe. I had it a minute ago. I can throw in the chat if you want the Dispatch article about Miriam. So I'm going to put that in the chat quickly. Oh, wait, nope. Liz already beat me to it. Thanks, Liz. So yeah, the first question, there's a couple questions for you, Isaac. So the first one is from an MTSO student who says, my church is working with immigrants in Dayton, though they're largely from Central America. How do you avoid being paternalistic in your treatment of those neighbors? And how do you help prepare people to be in relationship with them in mutually respectful kinds of ways?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think, well, I mean, yeah, that's something that we learned as we went, for sure, and how to train people, train volunteers to do this kind of work in a non-paternalistic way. So organizations like American Friends Service Committee actually developed an anti-racism guide training for churches who wanted to be involved in sanctuary work. So, you know, a training like that, I think, is really helpful. Yeah, and the other thing that comes to my mind is to think through exactly what the person in sanctuary is offering the community. We, at least in North Carolina, and I think this was the case, at least through the work of Church World Service, perhaps with other organizations that were doing this collective work, was to talk about the people in sanctuary as sanctuary leaders, and that they were actually the ones who were fighting the fight. They were like in la lucha, you know, they're the ones who are doing the work. And all of us are basically like their support team. So we followed in line with their leadership. So we would always make sure to call, to think about Rosa as a sanctuary leader, and we were there to support her and her needs, and yeah, take her advice seriously. So I would say that that's, you know, just the practical acknowledgement of a person's agency, that they're in charge and we're there as their support team.
I love it. It's like flipping the script.
Yeah,
You know?
and I mean, it was a little complicated. I mean, you know, all of us are different. Like, we got different things, different reasons for doing whatever. And a lot of people who were entered into sanctuary leaders, like, they took on a very public role, and they were basically activists and would offer leadership. That was not something that Rosa was comfortable with. I mean, she just needed a place to be, and, you know, we provided her with opportunities as she wanted them, but for the most part, she just didn't want to be deported, you know, and to be cared for in that process. So, you know, each person in sanctuary had a different experience of what it meant that they wanted from that relationship. So just being attentive to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that we have is whether you have any concern that public awareness around immigration is receding, with focus going towards other issues like COVID, racial justice, and right now, the change in presidential administrations?
Yeah, I think that's important. But this is where I'm struggling. I mean, to be honest, like, we worked really hard, like, throughout. I mean, I also, like, nationally would connect and organize with Mi Gente, which is an important group. I would, like, encourage anybody. Mi Gente is basically like a large, it's like the national Latinx organizing, political organizing group. And yeah, I mean, publicity was important, but I'm just not sure what kind of difference that made. I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. I would rather think about, at least when I think about the work going forward, I think it's time to go on the offensive instead of, let's just think about this as an immigration issue. But like I said, I really think that what we need to think about is citizenship in general. And one way to get at that, I mean, I'm not quite at the point of, like, needing to, like, abolish citizenship. I haven't thought through the politics of all that. But what I do think is a helpful step to experiment with is voting rights, and to extend voting rights, especially since the GOP, which has become the party of white supremacy, wants to suppress the vote in any way possible, that we need to figure out ways to empower voting. And I think that stretches from incarcerated people voting, finding ways to, to prevent, to basically to counteract the way that prisons and jails have become a form of disenfranchisement. But also to think through, people are talking about residency voting. So, states determine who's eligible to vote. I mean, this is a state decision. And there are ways that you can push state through legislation so that non-citizens can vote. So finding a way, that's the direction I want to go, is, instead of being like, oh gosh, the defensive here, like, how are we going to keep immigration central? I would rather say, let's go on the offensive and find ways to do residency voting. So that could be like providing some kind of documentation that you live in an area. It could also, the other thing that everybody has is an ITIN number. So even if you don't have a social security number, the government likes to collect your taxes. So undocumented people have an ITIN number because they pay taxes, more taxes than, like, Jared Kushner and all those people. So they deserve representation. So I think there are other ways to organize ourselves, either through an ITIN number, through residency, so that non-citizens can vote and shape our politics in a different direction.
So you've already begun to pivot towards the next question, and that is what kind of alternative systems to sort of the citizenship regime are you imagining?
Yeah, so exactly right. Yeah, I think that's it. The voter, I think, empowering the vote. I think it is a sign. I mean, yeah, somebody tell me if this is a bad way to think about it, but it does feel like a form of a identity legal fiction that's become a binary in a form that feels like segregation, to say that some people are empowered to demand to be represented by politicians, by representatives, and other people are not. So other people who are contributors to society, who make our communities work, who are part of our lives, our neighbors, paying taxes. I mean, if you want to be, like, insidious about it, economically productive. I think that we need to figure out a way to, transgress that binary, to, like, somehow dismantle that form of segregation in terms of representation.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense in some ways as you're talking. It strikes me as just as arbitrary and contingent as what used to be white property owning males. It's just an updated version of that. But it has the same effect. The effect is exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly. No, I like that.
So another question, and in full disclosure, this is my question. So folks from the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A so that I can ask them. But I want to talk about mine. One of the things that I know that I heard you talk about this evening, and I've also, we've seen it locally here in Columbus, is that there's a really important dimension to the public piece of sanctuary work in this moment. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know, and the reason that I'm getting at that is I'm thinking historically to other kinds of resistance movements, say the Underground Railroad thrived in secrecy. Like it worked to the extent that people didn't talk about it. And this is actually works on a very different logic. It works to the extent that there's a lot of talking and publicity. So could you talk about that and the way you understand the public aspect?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, that reminds me of something I should have said. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point about the link between the Underground Railroad and then what was going on in the 80s and the Overground Railroad and the secrecy involved there. And I think it's also important in terms of like our moment or the past 4 years is that, I mean, sanctuary is happening all over the place. Like, it's not like this church thing was the only thing happening, that there were people who were looking out for one another. I mean, just being people, like, you know, like, hey, yeah, the Immigrants coming, we heard, like, why don't you go to, you know, stay with our cousins in this, you know, other city for a while, or people are going up to DC a lot around here sometimes. So there is a sense of where like the secret, clandestine sanctuary work was going on as just part of like ordinary life where people look out for one another. And that's like really important. So that might be a way to say that that was also happening. In terms of like public sanctuary, what others learned from the 80s was that like the public perception, the will, the media was actually another layer of protection. So if you go back and read the FBI files and federal government files that have been like declassified from that era, I mean, they were just really freaked out about like not trespassing onto church property. You know, like that just really worried a lot of people, a lot of federal agents. And so there's like, whoa, let's just not do that. And that was enabled because of the press. Like these were people who were just like, all right, we're gonna do this in full disclosure, letting you all know that there's somebody here. And if you all show up, we're gonna call the same media that showed up for this press conference and they're gonna document it all. So I think that was part of it, is just this sense of using media as a form of protection for the people in sanctuary.
Good, thank you. The next question we have is from a student, and Joel writes his question, says, in his essay, Beyond Human Rights, Agamben?
Agamben, yeah, that's Agamben.
Sorry, butchered that. This is why I don't read and speak out loud like a cold script usually. And parenthetically, although I'm simplifying and probably interpreting him into far more of a practical dimension than he'd be comfortable with, so he proposes a sort of dissolution of national borders in order to realize or enact a sort of transnational citizenry or identity, a sort of being in exodus. So the question is do you have any hope for a policy of open borders to enact immigrant justice, or does that sound like a lost cause?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Am I allowed to post in chat for everybody? Oh yeah, panel content. Okay.
I think so.
For the student who's interested in the Agamben connection, I just remembered I wrote this thing. It's more academic, but it's around Agamben and immigrant justice stuff. Anyhow, yeah, I mean, I do want to think through the promises of open borders. I find that attractive that, you know, Agamben and others have articulated it as a form of like basically a nomadic disruption of sovereignty and all of that. I find that hopeful and promising as like a utopian vision. And I don't mean utopian in the sense of like pie in the sky never happened. I mean, I'm an abolitionist. So I do think that like utopian visions guide us in terms of our politics now. And that's important. My concern so far, at least, I mean, just the stuff that I've read and thought through is I haven't seen people who have taken seriously the fact that the flow of transnational capital actually prefers open borders because it allows capital and factories and the production of resources to have like open reign over anybody. You know, like all of a sudden people are fleeing from one country to another depending on like who has the least regulations for workers or whatever it might be, you know, like and there is something to the I mean, surprisingly, to the nation state in its most like socialist form, providing ways to protect against the vampire nature of transatlantic transnational capitalism. So, I mean, yeah, for the footnotes in my mind are like heart and agree and all of that stuff. Like, yes, but I think they were actually a little too. I think they had hopes for a world without nation states that didn't take into account the way that capital becomes a form of sovereignty. I mean, they do talk about that actually, and that nation states actually provide a way to mitigate against some of those those crass evils.
Yeah,
that's me thinking through things. I feel shaky on this. I do like open borders, but I also recognize the way that there are evils in the flow of capital that need to be that people need to be protected from somehow.
great. So now the questions are really rolling in. So this is from another MTSO student who asked the question that is, it's not the same as the one that was just asked, but it gets at sort of a related issue. It says, climate change is increasingly driving migration, either directly or indirectly. Given the disproportionate responsibility for the United States in climate change, would you comment on the implications of your work on that connection?
Wait, so basically climate change and immigration?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is super important. The person who was really good on this, I mean, who was, I can't remember when his book came out. I think it was the early 2000s. But Christian Perenti, who is an amazing journalist and writer, he wrote it feels like he's just like, he's a bit prophetic in the sense of naming issues before they arise. So his first book was actually on the emergence of like the police state in the United States. Like he nailed it with that. I can't remember what the name of that book is called. That was the early one. But then the one after that is called Tropic of Chaos. I'm pretty sure that's right. And he wrote it in like maybe late 90s, early 2000s. And he basically goes to these different places throughout the tropics. So the Tropic of Capricorn and Cancer. Somebody help me here. And documents how climate change was already forcing climate refugees to flee because of, and the creation of wars and violence because of the scarcity of resources and water. So he spent time in like in that area in Africa and then also in South America, and then maybe in, I don't know, in some, basically around the world in those tropics, and documents how this was happening, climate refugees was happening. And the thing that is important about that book, what he shows was that the US government knew about this the whole time. So in the midst of everybody, not everybody, in the midst of the Koch brothers funded Republican candidates and elected officials, in the midst of their climate denial, those very same representatives were in national defense meetings where they were presented with evidence that this was the future, that climate change was the future, and that, like all these, like most of the world's population is on the coasts in between the tropics, and those places are going to be underwater by 2050. Therefore, the Department of Defense, US Department of Defense, recommended that we build walls, that we prepare for climate refugees, which is what's been happening over the past 20, 30 years. And the model that they adopted, and this was in one of the documents, I remember, this was a while since I read the book. The book's really good. But the thing that Perenti shows in these documents, these the Department of Defense documents, is they adopted a armed lifeboat, is what the language was that they used. So in a world that's going to be ravaged by climate change, that the United States needed to prepare to become a armed lifeboat basically as in the model of Noah's Ark, but policed with borders and drones and more immigration policy that restrict people from coming to this country. So I think that is exactly the future. It is climate change, climate refugees. I mean, it's already happening. I mean, one of the effects of NAFTA in Central America was the production of all these people who, like the production of a population surge needing to find food, their crops were no longer sellable at a price that to sustain themselves. I mean, the US flooded the market with corn. And so and then they were losing crops because of climate chaos. And so they were fleeing for the sake of their families to the United States. So yeah, I think that is exactly the world we have in store for us.
Awesome. So we have time for
not awesome. Not awesome.
Well, no, not awesome. Thank you. Awesome answer is what I meant. Not awesome.
Oh gosh.
So we've got time for two more questions. One is one that I'm going to read it, and the other I see we've got a hand up in the audience from Dr. June Sick Park. So Dr. Park will get the last question. So this question is regarding the large sanctuary movement that has never happened. Are you thinking of these next 4 years as a time to put a lot of energy into sanctuary organizing for future needs? Or do you anticipate focusing more energy on large scale immigration reform? Or maybe is it not an either or?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I just want to say, first of all, I'm really tired. So like this has been exhausting, like these past 4 years. Like, I mean, when, after, I mean, I'm not like, I'm not a huge Biden guy. He wasn't the candidate that I voted for in the primaries for sure. And I would definitely want somebody else, but like just the weight of realizing that Trump was not going to be in office anymore has provided me with an opportunity just to like get my bearings and rest. So I should say like, I believe in doing the work and I want to jump in to do that. But part of me is just like, I mean, this past month, I've realized that I've had like a low grade anxiety for the past 4 years, not knowing what's going to happen with Rose, like if ICE is going to, anyhow. So in that sense, like, I just need to rest for a little bit. But I do think that all of this immigration work, immigrant justice work, immigrant solidarity work is part of like, needs to be framed, at least in the world that I'm in, needs to be framed in the larger discourse of the carceral state. That the United States is a settler colony that is founded upon Euro-nationalist commitments that require a police state in order to keep the populace under control, and that we live in a carceral regime that needs to be dismantled. So I think that immigration justice needs to be part of that kind of conversation. So, like I mean, Angela Davis, who's always been like a guide in all these conversations. I mean, she's named the way that her work in terms of prison abolition has to be part of the same kinds of conversations of immigrant solidarity work. Detention centers are part of, like, you know, the carceral society. So I would say, as I think about, I think these conversations need to happen together, is what I'm saying. Immigrant justice needs to go alongside, needs to be part of abolitionist conversations about prisons and how prisons occupy our world and, you know, become the restrictions on our imagination of what is possible.
Thank you for that. Dr. Park, you get the last question. If you want to put your hand, I see your hand is down. If you want to put it, if you want to speak, put it back up again, and I will do what needs to be done to enable you to speak. Okay. Kathy. Checking to see if there's. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Kathy Dixon.
Yeah, I didn't mean to put my hand up. I wasn't trying to cut anyone off. I don't know how you do that. Thank you for leading this part of the conversation. And Isaac, you've done great work, not just tonight, but I mean, over all of these years. So I do hope you find meaningful ways to rest. And we're glad that you've been able to find some time to write and to share with the rest of us. We put Isaac's website in the chat, as well as you can follow him on Twitter and be in touch with him if you have other questions for him. And with MTSO, stay in touch with us if you'd like to be in conversation about this or other things. Stay tuned to our website, mtso.edu. This, as many of our events, will be archived on our website, so you can visit it again if you'd like. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Have a good night.